Hi, I'm Dianna Anderson, and welcome to episode 12 of How Do I Lead Now? In this episode, we're going to talk about the importance of discerning patterns. Here's why I think this is such an important leadership skill. As our world becomes more interconnected and more complicated, our ability to make change happen is really dependent upon our ability to understand how things connect, what influences what, and where those leverage points are for change. If you think about it, most of our traditional approaches to problem solving and leadership assume that we can get control over whatever we're trying to fix or solve. So whether, the problem is within our own division or even within our own company, we had the sense that we had control of the various components. We could figure out where the problem was and fix it. But with systems and with patterns, it's more important to be able to understand the interconnectivity of things in order to understand where to focus in order to create change. Let me give you a really, really simple example, and then we'll kind of take it a little bit broader. Behavior itself is a pattern. Okay, so when I say pattern, by the way, what I mean is there's different components that are influencing an outcome. So how somebody shows up and behaves is actually a pattern, if you will, that is influenced not just by the choices that they're making, in that moment, but by the assumptions and beliefs that they hold, the skills that they've got. All kinds of things are influencing why people make the choices that they do. And when we want to invite someone to change their behavior, we've got to think about that pattern. So as an example, a long time ago, I worked with a senior leader who had just been promoted and placed in charge of a leadership team that was facing some changes. And I got brought in for a series of reasons, but one of the symptoms that we were addressing was the fact that he was really shutting down the HR person in meetings. When this woman would begin to explain things or talk about it, he would just kind of cut the conversation off and move on, which was, of course, problematic. And if in old leadership, a problem-solving style of approach would be to go to him and say, just stop cutting off the HR person and listen to her. And we know that wouldn't work. So if we think about behavior as a pattern, my job as a coach was to understand where that behavior was coming from. So I explored a lot of different things, including what was really important to him, what bothered him, just to discern why he might be doing what he was doing. And essentially what came out was he had a great passion for being a really impactful leader. He also had a really high value for efficiency. And he had come from a really different part of the company, so he wasn't that familiar with the kinds of conversations that the HR person was wanting to introduce. And so through our conversation, the leverage point for change became him shifting his thinking, so shifting the pattern in his thinking to see that in order to be a really successful leader for this company, he actually needed to understand all of the inputs that made up the whole of their experience, including how people were trained and supported and all the things that HR was bringing. So when he was able to see that actually he needed to listen to this person, he was really interested in building his skills to do that. And that's where a lot of the coaching focused on, was building his capability to hear something that was different than what he was used to, and in such a way that he could discern the value of it and see the interconnectivity. So you can hear there's a number of different patterns here. His pattern of thinking, the pattern that he was trying to influence as a leader, and how those two connected. That's just a really simple example of how patterns are playing out all around us. What I think is really cool about that conversation, though, is this idea that shifting one small thing can actually change a whole pattern of behavior. So, in this case, with the leader that I was working with, when he saw that in order to be a really successful leader, he had to change his pattern of thinking, think more broadly, and become more inclusive in order to attain his outcome that he was interested in. Everything about his leadership style changed, not just his reaction to the HR person, but how he interacted with everybody. This is actually a kind of a concept that Charles Duhigg points to in his really wonderful book, The Power of Habit. And Charles Duhigg calls it a keystone habit. I would call it just an underlying assumption or belief. But the point is, there's always, not always maybe, but hopefully, often, let's put it that way, frequently, one way of if you can find a leverage point in a pattern that will actually often change a lot about the pattern. But if you can't see the entire pattern, you can't figure out where the leverage point is, and you can be hammering away on something that is completely inconsequential and getting really frustrated because you're not getting the kind of change you want or need. So the value of learning to discern patterns is you can see where the leverage points are for change. In the case of the Charles Duhigg example in The Power of Habit, he talks about how Alcoa was able to completely change their culture by changing their habits around safety. It's a great story, and it really illustrates the power of understanding a pattern of behavior in order to leverage change. So I hope that those couple of little examples have convinced you at least to get curious about your capabilities to discern patterns in various things. And there's lots of ways that you can experiment with getting better at this. I mean, I think one great place to begin to think about patterns of behavior right now and how they are impacting us is to look at systemic racism. Obviously, a huge pattern that is having huge consequences, so it's not an easy thing to get your head around. But even just beginning to get into the exploration is going to teach you a lot about how patterns create unintended consequences, and that in order to change them, we've got to be able to discern what they are. So I would encourage you to find some way to explore patterns. Again, I think that's a fantastic one. There's some great resources out there right now that are helping people to see, to discern how systems are working here in ways that are obviously disempowering so many people. A simple resource that you could explore if you're really not quite sure where to begin is a book I'm reading right now called Waking Up White. And in this book, the author is really sharing her personal story of kind of waking up and seeing that her own thinking and the way she was raised and assumptions and beliefs that she was taught actually caused her not to be able to see the system of racism. And when she woke up to it and started to see it, she could see how changing her thinking was allowing her to see patterns of racism all around her. It's a great way to introduce yourself to the concept of seeing patterns, and certainly a timely education for all of us if that's something that you benefit from. So this week, I hope that you will reflect upon how patterns are playing out around you. I also hope you'll find a way to deepen your skills, whatever they may be, because as a leader, I feel right now, in order to create any kind of meaningful change, we've got to be thinking in terms of patterns and systems. And so I would love for you to reflect upon where you're at with that and see what you can do to deepen your capabilities. As always, please send me your insights, your thoughts, your observations, and any questions that you might have that you'd like me to address. And I hope that you will join me next week when I'm going to talk a little bit about how to begin to influence patterns a little bit more. So I hope that we will be able to connect then. And until then, have a fantastic week. Thanks so much. Bye for now.